Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, I'm announcing the City of Arches Kickstarter, which is coming on August 6th. We're going to take a look at that, and we're going to take a quick peek at the 42-page preview that's going to be available when the Kickstarter goes live. You're going to want to sign up. Don't forget. Our D&D Beyond's pre-order exclusives, anti-consumer. There's been a lot of energy about D&D Beyond's pre-order exclusives. I'm going to talk about that, and we're going to dive into that topic. I'm going to dive also into the topic of the lost modularity of D&D. That D&D in the olden days, are not that old, of the 2012 to 2014 D&D Next playtest focused a lot on the modularity of D&D, and that seems to be something that we've lost. We're going to talk about that. What is the best D&D starter set for teaching people how to play D&D? And is it Shadowdark? That's going to be a topic. And we're going to cover our first batch of questions from the July 2024 Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm your pal, Mike Shea from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of great tools, tips, tricks, and previews of products that I'm putting out. They get access to the awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord, and they help me put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your support. For 2.5 years, I have been working on a product called the City of Arches. Patrons have watched this product grow from a small 12-page PDF into a bigger than 100-page PDF that has been available to patrons. I am now taking this product to Kickstarter. In the show notes, you will find a link to the Kickstarter pre-launch page. On there is a great big green button that says Notify Me on Launch. Go and click that button. That will email you when the Kickstarter goes live so that you too can download the 42-page preview of the City of Arches sourcebook, look at it, understand it, and hopefully back this project. I am super excited about this. Again, I've been working on it for 2.5 years. The City of Arches is a high fantasy city sourcebook for lazy GMs. It is built from a GM to GMs to make it easy for you to take this material and use it to build your own adventures and your own campaigns. A bunch of GMs have already done so, and it's a fantastic place for you to build either your own stories with your own players. Here is the sample. There's the preview. You get a preview of the sample of the City of Arches sourcebook. Fantastic, beautiful cover by Ellie Briggs. We have some awesome art in here throughout the whole thing so you can get an idea of what kind of art this has. Really, when we talk about like what the Kickstarter is funding, it is funding the art, the editing, the design, the layout, and the physical manufacturing of the book. That is why we have to take it to Kickstarter. And it is going to be awesome. But the 42-page sourcebook is totally playable. You can use this 42-page sourcebook to run the introduction adventure, to run a separate adventure that sits on top of the introduction and gives you a good feeling for what the city is like, what makes it unique, and everything in that is a beautiful, well laid out preview, fully edited, fully designed, been play tested. It's really awesome. Great. Just, I'm super proud of it. When I opened up this preview package, I was so happy to see the kind of stuff we have there. Tips like this, like how do you reveal, what are ways that people can get their secrets revealed? How do you have, useful NPCs all throughout the book? You'll find these like design tips from lazy game masters, ways to understand how to use the material that's in this book. Here is an awesome full color version of the City of Arches map. The original Patreon version had a black and white version of this map. This is done by Chloe Beland. There's going to be, I think, 4 maps like this in here for 4 different major regions in and around the city. It's going to be just awesome. I can't wait for the book, but I also can't wait to launch the Kickstarter so that so many people can enjoy the preview and everything that's in here as well. So very exciting stuff. To give you an idea of some of like the main points about what the City of Arches is about. Obviously, this Kickstarter is built to help fund a full color PDF and hardcover sourcebook, aiming right now at 160 pages, but we're going to see how it goes either one way or the other, depending on what kind of material we have once everything gets laid out. But it's going to be a big, meaty source book. It figures tons of adventure locations that are in, above, below, around, outside the City of Arches. So it's not just the city itself. It's not just about a city where you go and commerce. It's definitely a place built for adventures. There are adventure hooks everywhere. Tons of stuff you're going to see. It is 95% system agnostic. So you can use this book with pretty much any high high fantasy RPG, whether it's Shadowdark, whether it's Dungeon World, but it's definitely playable with any of the variants of 5e. We're actually designing it specifically so that you can use different elements from 5e from different systems so that you can use whatever version of 5e you like to play in the City of Arches. There is an introduction scenario, very quick scenario that you can run in probably certainly under an hour, maybe even less, that gives you a good idea of what the City of Arches is like, what makes it unique, and what draws your characters into adventure. And the preview plus the main book are going to have supplementary adventures. There's going to be one in the preview, and then there's about 3 or 4 adventures that are in the main book that kind of take it from this intro adventure and onwards. There is a player's guide that's going to be part of the preview package as well, so that you can hand it out to your players so they can build backgrounds, they can get connections to major NPCs, and they can get a good understanding of what the City of Arches is like to build their characters. There are 10 large regions of adventures, including the Upper City, the Lower Reaches, the Cliffs of the Dead, the Endless Warrens, Sunken Revia, 3 regions of the Borderlands, the Vaults of the Nameless King, and the Worlds Beyond the Arches. All of these filled out with descriptions of what they are like, adventure hooks for how to build adventures in there. Tons. There's hundreds of adventure hooks throughout this whole thing. There are 3 first level to 20th level campaign arcs. So rather than building it as a series of adventures that are already all fleshed out, instead we give these adventure arcs that are about 3 pages long that give you an idea of how you could take an adventure or how you could take an entire campaign from 1st to 20th level. They're very modular, so you can take pieces of those, you can mash them up together, you can run even just small segments of them rather than the whole thing. Very much built to help you be inspired to build your own campaigns. The whole book is designed to be very flexible. You can take individual locations, you can take the whole city, and you can drop it into whatever campaign you're running. It is directly intended to be focused around this one single city and the region around it, so that you can take that region and you can drop it into the Forgotten Realms. You could drop it into Eberron. You could drop it into Midgard. You could drop it into your own home campaign. It is designed to flex around you and the kind of story that you want to tell. It is not dictating to you an entire world's philosophy. Instead, it is something you can drop into an existing world. Patrons of Sly Flourish, get access to the 42-page preview right now. It is already available to patrons of Sly Flourish. They have seen it. And if you want to see the preview before the Kickstarter launches on August 6th, you too can see it by joining the Patreon. Link to the Patreon is in the show notes below. I am super excited about the City of Arches. You are going to hear more about it over the following weeks. I'm going to show more bits and pieces of it, more pieces of artwork and everything else. So should be a really good time. And I can't wait for you to see it. I'm super excited about it. I don't think I have worked on any project this long. Every other book that I've done I've kind of sat down and focused on the whole thing and done. This is one that I have purposefully built slowly over time, testing it with patrons, getting feedback on it, twisting and running different versions of it myself, having other people run versions of it. It's going to be very, very cool. Please sign up. Click on the Notify on Launch. Go to the preview page. Go to the Kickstarter preview page. Click on Notify on Launch, and you too will learn about the City of Arches. This past week, there's been a lot of news about D&D Beyond's pre-order exclusives. PC Gamer is probably the biggest article that I had seen about this, where they were saying, and with the super neutral opinion of, oh, for goodness sakes, D&D has early access periods and pre-order bonuses like a 3D model of a dragon for a virtual tabletop that doesn't exist yet. And here's the sub-headline. The worst habits of video game storefronts are making their way to pen and paper. The main kind of criticism comes from this image where it shows the kind of things that you get when you pre-order it, like virtual dice sets, frames for your characters, backdrops for your characters, early access to be able to see the material either 1 week or 2 weeks early, depending on what kind of tier you have, bundles of saving bundles, the Dragons of D&D, which is like an exclusive art book, I guess a digital art book that you would get if you buy all of the core rule books, both digitally and physically, which is pretty expensive. I think it's like $180 or something like that. And the other one that got people's attention is the Gold Dragon Digital Mini. So the article from PC Gamer has made its way around. I've seen a huge thread over on EN World where people were talking about what this meant and kind of getting, lots of different opinions on it. I've made its way over into the Sly Flourish Discord server where people were kind of like upset about the fact that they were seeing this and like, these are like the worst video game problems where we see all of these exclusive buy-ins. Rascal Nut News had a thing about it as well, where they talked about things like where pre-order bonuses went wrong and they weren't fulfilled for a long time. And they're like, here comes Wizards of the Coast doing it with D&D, which has not been a video game, but now we're starting to see video game stuff. I have an opinion about it. Everyone's got an opinion about it, but I've got an opinion about it that I wanted to share because I really haven't seen my opinion represented in a lot of the conversations they had. My number one opinion is, I don't think it's anti-competitive. I don't think it's actually that big a deal. Instead, I think that this is a symptom of a bigger problem, which is the growing platform dominance of D&D Beyond as a replacement for D&D. And I've talked about it on this show before. And to me, the warning sign is not this. This is a symptom, not a cause. Wizards of the Coast deciding to make pre-order bonuses and stuff like this is a symptom of gaining control over the hobby through a single platform, which is D&D Beyond. To me, the real warning sign was when they started to bring other 5e publishers onto their platform, because that starts to grow the platform out and it becomes even bigger and more dominant. And the more dominant it is, the more you're going to start to see stuff like this. So the idea that this stuff, I don't think it matters. Like, who cares about a Gold Dragon VTT mini? I don't. Who cares about the art book? The art's going to be in the books. I don't really care. So that doesn't bother me. Like, the pre-order stuff doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me that it looks like video game stuff too, because what should we expect? Why would we expect something different? It is an $8 billion company with a bunch of executives who have come, and I think some now there's been some churn at the top, so I don't know if this is the case, but at least some of the executives had come from video game worlds. They'd come from digital worlds. And there's definitely a big drive to move to a digital scape. Magic the Gathering with Arena, D&D Beyond with D&D, the new 3D virtual tabletop, the success of Baldur's Gate 3, the whole E1 thing of like trying to get into digital entertainment and digital video games and stuff like that. We know that Wizards wants probably to do two things. One, be a AAA video game company, and two, be Disney, right? So why are we surprised that an $8 billion company is acting like an $8 billion company? We shouldn't be. But what we should do is remember they are not out there for the betterment of the TTRPG community. If they are, it's a byproduct of what they're doing. It is not their drive and their ambition. They are a publicly traded company. They have their shareholders are their primary customers are their shareholders, and they are driving towards that. So should we be surprised that an $8 billion company is acting like an $8 billion company? No. Now, here's another kind of interesting little bit of hypocrisy. A lot of the same people, I don't think it was like PC Gamer, but I know Rascal talked about this. When they took away I'm coding it microtransactions, i.e. the ability to buy individual pieces of a book rather than an entire book. When they took that away, people also complained, hey, this was a feature I used to have. I used to be able to buy just one subclass for a couple of bucks, and now I have to buy the entire book, and that sucks. But microtransactions is exactly the kind of thing that video games have done that have pissed people off about video games. So you can't both say, I'm really mad that you took away the feature for me to buy microtransactions over here, and you're doing pre-order exclusive over here, and I'm very angry about it. Now you're just being angry, because the reality is those are both the same thing. Worrying about them having exclusive Gold Dragon 3D virtual tabletop tokens and 1 week or 2 week early access to a book or a digital art book, when you're complaining about that part of it, you're already too late. And the part to complain about is D&D Beyond growing as to be too dominant a central platform to the point where you can only ever deal with that kind of stuff when you want to interact with the game. That's what I'm worried about. Now, the good news is it seems like things are actually pretty good on that front. And the main things that I say on that is one of the things that was going to be an indicator for me that it was really going badly was by not releasing D&D 2024 products on other competing platforms. And they are indeed releasing D&D 2024 on those other competing platforms, including expanding to a platform that they had not previously supported, which is Foundry, which means that you can get the D&D 2024 books on Roll20, on Foundry, on Fantasy Grounds, and on D&D Beyond. There are 4 different digital platforms. So this is, again, why it's very different from video gaming. You can't say, hey, I want to play Destiny, but I want to play on an entirely, not just an entirely different platform, but an entirely different game engine. I want to take my character from Destiny and play them in a whole different competing system. That's really what we're talking about here, right? It's not about D&D being the platform. We're talking about the entire architecture and the entire infrastructure through which you can play D&D. Now, of course, the big one is you can always still play in pen and paper. They're selling physical books. We know the core books are going to be physical books. I think there's nobody who's like, there was a conspiracy theory a while ago that they weren't going to sell physical books. I think we can put that one to rest. We know that they're going to sell the 3 core books and physical books. And what Wizards of the Coast decides to do with D&D after those 3 core books are out kind of doesn't matter, because at that point, the books that they're putting out really aren't that much different than the books that other publishers are going to put out for 5th edition that are compatible with those core books. So that gives us a super wide range of things that we can build off of. One of the things that I think is very interesting about these kinds of arguments, the kind of like, oh, look, they're acting like a video game company, we're angry about that. It gives too much power to Wizards of the Coast to be complaining about stuff like this, because it treats D&D the way that I think the executives at Wizards of the Coast want us to treat D&D, which is as a monolithic platform like Amazon or like Microsoft or like Sony or like Apple. And we don't have to treat them that way, because the fundamental nature of the book is a physical book, that we have our own physical copy. They cannot take this away from us. We can use just this book to play the game at our table without needing anything else ever. They cannot remove this. We can always play this game. So it's fundamentally different than all of the other digital platforms. So the idea that we are worried about what they're doing from a digital storefront, if you're pissed off about what D&D Beyond is doing, stop using D&D Beyond. You can still play D&D, or just don't care, right? Just don't worry about it, because we can always still play D&D. The core fundamental nature of D&D cannot be removed from our power. We have the power. We are the strong ones here, because we can do whatever we want. Now, the truth is, when I read articles like this, I kind of don't mind, because I feel like it is holding the feet to the fire. Marker. I don't get really upset too much about stuff like this, because it is holding their feet to the fire for the largest company in this hobby. And I don't think that is bad. I think that, like, if we're holding them accountable for the stuff that they're doing, that's fine. Where it bothers me is when it's completely untrue. And actually, I think it actually bolsters their company when there are false accusations. There were a couple, like one a long time ago during the OGL fiasco. This is a really interesting thing that happened during the OGL fiasco. So when the whole OGL thing was going on at the beginning of 2023, all of the staff from Wizards of the Coast that were on Twitter were totally radio silent. They weren't saying anything on Twitter or any other social media platform until the accusation came out that they weren't reading playtest feedback. One of the people who was putting out a lot of information about the OGL also claimed to have inside information that said they weren't even reading the playtest feedback, that there was no way they could read all the playtest feedback. And then all of a sudden, all of those designers who were radio silent for the OGL came out and said that is absolute BS. We totally read the feedback and everything goes out. Now, they got permission. I'm almost sure. I don't have any true facts on this, that they were told specifically, do not engage. We're trying to manage this situation with the OGL. Do not engage on Twitter. You'll be in big trouble if you do. Except when that came out and they said, okay, now you can engage about this because we want you guys to say what's true. So that's one where it was like a false accusation strengthens Wizards' position, right? And the same is true for things like the false AI art controversies. There was a bunch of controversy that the dwarf that was going to be on the cover of the Player's Handbook was AI art. It turned out to be total BS. And not only did it weaken any kind of position or thought about the actual topics of AI, it actually insulted the artist who had made it, who's just a person making art, right? This is somebody who got a really good deal to be able to do art on the front page. That hurts somebody, right? That hurt a person who didn't deserve to be hurt because they made a really cool cover that a lot of people liked. And now this AI art thing gets thrown out all the time now. Like every piece of art that Wizards ever puts out, somebody's like, oh, that looks like AI art to me. The fingers are weird. And they're not, right? So I do get upset about that. I don't mind stuff like this because it's like, no, they really did put out those pre-order purchases. And clearly, and there were people on the Sly Flourish Discord server where I explained my point. They're like, I'm not bothered by that. I'm bothered by platform dominance. This stuff doesn't matter. This isn't a candle going out. This isn't them hurting the hobby, because they can't hurt the hobby the same way. This is just them doing nonsense on their own platform. And they were like, well, I'm still mad about it. And you're like, okay, that's totally fair. You get to be mad about it. The person at PC Gamer gets to be mad about it because it is something they actually did. And then they push back on it and that goes back and forth. So I kind of don't mind too much about the criticism of it, as long as the criticism is legitimate. But a lot of times when the criticism goes to a place where it actually puts more power over the hobby with Wizards of the Coast than they actually have, and that one can kind of bother me. I'm coming back to the same statement I've made now for years. And one of the reasons why I like to talk about topics like this is because it gives me the opportunity to reinforce this statement. Do not let any company dictate your happiness with the TTRPG hobby. It doesn't matter who the company is, but obviously the bigger they are, the more that could be the case. And Wizards of the Coast is definitely one of them, but there's other companies too. Don't let the drive of any one company dictate your happiness with TTRPGs, because they don't. They don't have to, and you don't have to. Now, okay, how hypocritical am I being? I had a big topic on it last week, got a lot of attention where I was talking about how Wizards made the statement on D&D Beyond saying, hey, this new character effect is going to be annoying to your game master. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like that. Got a lot of attention, right? And then here I am talking about it again. I got 2 topics on my show today talking about Wizards of the Coast and their handling of D&D. So who now is letting their happiness be dictated by the world of D&D? It's like, well, this guy. However, my happiness isn't there because, I'm running a Shadowdark game in 2 hours, right? And Wizards of the Coast has nothing to do with that. No company has it. Well, one company does, Arcane Library, run by one person who clearly loves D&D. So, my own enjoyment of D&D, the actual game at the table, is not dictated by the drive of any one company. So I think that is the real lesson here. And I think the thing to watch is and it's not a thing to watch overall, but it's a thing to watch for you and me, right? You specifically. How much does your drive of D&D and of TTRPGs depend upon a single platform like Roll20 or like D&D Beyond? And if the answer is a lot, if the answer is I can't think how I would play this game without this stuff, you're in a vulnerable position. If, on the other hand, you say, well, actually, it's not hard for me to use my monsters outside of Roll20 and I can just roll dice at my table and I really only use it for the VTT, then it's not so bad. So think about the resilience of your hold on the hobby and the question of, can something like this, for them putting out pre-orders or them doing some nonsense or them taking features away or them deciding where they're going to focus their books, how much does that impact your hold on the hobby? And if the answer is not much, then we're good. And if the answer is a lot, we can think about how we have our hands around this hobby and how we drive the hobby to make sure that we can enjoy it no matter what any company does with it. So one of the things that this recent, a whole bunch of different preview videos have come out that Wizards of the Coast has been releasing over the past few weeks, I expect to bolster pre-order sales of the core rule books over on D&D Beyond. But it really stirred up a lot of conversation. It stirred up a lot of thoughts in me. I was talking to a friend of mine about it this morning, that I wasn't really thinking much about D&D 2024 until I started seeing these videos. And the videos, instead of making me really excited for the game, mostly because I'm a DM far more than I'm a player, is that it really stirred up a lot of other thoughts about kind of what it could have been or other things like that. And it made me lament some of the choices that were made and made me think about how we, again, can kind of get our hands around our version of the hobby. And one part that I don't really think has been discussed, a lot of stuff has been discussed about the powers themselves, the general power creep that's come up. I talked about how I think some of these things are going to make it harder for me to DM the game. I'm particularly worried about the length of combat turns. That combat turns was a big problem in 4E. It was one of the reasons I was really excited to move to 5E. Now I'm starting to see every character have more options on every turn, which means turns are going to take longer. I don't know that was really the best direction. I don't even know if that's true. It could turn out, no, they really don't add anything to the length of battle, but we'll have to see. Because I remember, 4th edition, for me, it was a really big problem. But one of the other things that I haven't heard anybody really talk about is the loss of the modularity of D&D. Back when Wizards of the Coast was first working on the D&D Next playtest, this was the playtest that moved into the 5th edition of D&D, that moved into the 2014 version of D&D. They ran a very extensive playtest for D&D. And a couple of the things that they did back then were really interesting. One thing is that all of the designers that were working on it played every version of D&D from the basic set all the way through 4th edition. They played BX, they played AD&D, they played 2nd edition D&D, they played 3rd edition D&D. I don't know if they played 3rd and 3.5. They might have. They played 4th edition, and it put the game fresh in their minds. And the designers at the time had a big mix of different opinions on it. Some of them had worked on the 4th edition of D&D. Some of them had worked on previous versions. Some were very tied in with the old school Renaissance OSR kind of ideas. Other ones were very much for the modernization of the game. And so they all kind of had this in mind when they were designing D&D. And one of the things that they said they really wanted to do, this is back during the D&D Next playtest, is that they wanted the next version of D&D to be very modular so that different groups could decide what kind of D&D they wanted to play. And the idea was things like, imagine if skills were optional. So you have that big skill list. Well, what if you didn't have the skill list? And what if instead you only had ability scores? And then you added your proficiency bonus to an ability score when it made sense for your class or your background. And instead, if you decided, no, for our group, we do want to have a more robust skill set, so then you bring in that list of skills. So that went through playtesting, and they actually said so many people were saying that they wanted skills to be part of the core of the system that they decided to add that in. However, that optional rule about you can skip the skill system and you can focus just on abilities did make its way into the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. You can actually see it. If you open up, nobody ever reads it, but if you read your 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, you would see that in there are optional rules to apply proficiency bonuses to abilities that your class would be good at. I don't know if it has your background, but you could certainly tie it to background as well. It's very easy to do that. And then it even has a system, and I know that Professor Dungeon Master has talked about this on the Dungeon Craft channel, that there's even a way that instead of having a proficiency bonus, you have a proficiency die, which is an extra die that you add on to your roll when you're rolling, a D4 instead of 2, a D6 instead of 3, and so on. And that actually added some extra variance on what proficiency was. So some of those optional rules were in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it kind of gave you this idea of modularity. But another major area of modularity in D&D Next that did make its way into the core was the idea that, for example, that feats were optional, that you could either choose to have an ability score increase or a feat, but only one or the other. And actually, and the feats themselves were considered optional rules. That's why there's only one feat in the SRD, the system reference document that Wizards of the Coast released, only has one feat as an example, because they generally feel like feats are an optional feature. Otherwise, you just have ability score improvements. And even in games where you did allow feats, most of the time characters didn't start picking feats until about 8th level, and sometimes 12th level. And the reason why is that ability score increases were just more beneficial. That if you could boost your primary ability, you knew you were going to use that for a lot of different things, including skills and including combat things and damage and everywhere else. So it was almost always better to include an ability score improvement than it was to include a feat. So even when groups brought in the optional feat rule and allowed it, players generally didn't pick it until you started to hit 8th level. But now, some of that stuff is just not making it anymore. Not only is it not, the modularity seems to be missing from 2024, but entirely new features that are being brought in aren't considered modular, they're considered part of core. So an example is, not only are feats no longer an optional feature where you can decide if you're going to include them in your group or not, but you start to get them at first level. And feats now include ability score increases, which means you're definitely better off taking a feat every time you have the option to take a feat, because it includes an ability score bump too. Now it's only a +1 bonus, but if you have odd scores, you can always increase an odd score to an even score, which gives you the equivalent of like the +2 bonus if you can figure that out. So the reality is now not only feats have now not only become non-optional anymore, not only are they part of core, but you get them earlier because you start to get them at first level, and the feats are more powerful because you include an ability score increase. And none of that is optional. That modularity is lost. Two other interesting things. So like potions as a bonus action was one of the most common house rules that I had ever heard of. When I did polls on it, or when I was reading about what people used for house rules for 2014 D&D, the idea that you could drink a potion as a bonus action was a very common house rule. And I played in a game that used it, and it worked really well. And I actually don't think it's a problem. And I'm not even sure that's that problem in a core, but that very much could have been considered an optional improvement. That like, hey, we know you like to do things the way they're done in 2014, but in this version, we have like a set of house rules. And one of those is you could have potions being drunk as a bonus action. That is no longer modular. Now it's core. We think that that's the way it should be. Can you house rule it out? Yeah, but that's different. House ruling out a feature is different than house ruling in a feature. Weapon masteries is another big example. Weapon masteries could be the biggest change that 2024 D&D is bringing to the game, next to the superpowered feats. Like, superpowered feats are definitely a big deal, but I think weapon masteries are going to have a bigger effect at the table. And the reason why is that now weapon attacks always have some other kind of weird kicker on them. And this is what I was talking about last week, when I'm worried that all of these weird kickers are going to have a lot of weird effects in the game, but also make rounds take longer, and that the game is going to be harder to run because everything is slowing down, because everybody that's fighting with a weapon now has all of these additional features that they have on there. That could have been an optional rule. You could have said like, hey, if you want to add more crunch to your game, if you want marshals to have more kind of interesting powers tied to their weapons, here's a set of optional house rules that you could apply to make weapons more interesting. Again, the 2014 DMG includes stuff like this in there. It doesn't include it exactly as weapon masteries, but it talks about cleave and it talks about some other features. That could have been optional, but instead it's core. So we don't even know what it's going to do. Like, I know it's been available in playtests and stuff like that, but playtests are not that similar to what's been going on in the game overall. And we're not really going to know what the impact of these is over a year. Now, the reality is a lot of times these optional rules that I was talking about, things like feats being optional, most groups just use them anyway, especially for feats, because feats were in the player's handbook. So it's kind of hard to say, hey, there's this big chunk of stuff in the player's handbook, but you don't get to use it because we don't want feats to be used in this campaign. There are some groups that did that, but my understanding is about 90% of the groups that I surveyed were using feats. So there is sort of a practicality to this. Like, how often do you bother to make something modular if everybody's always using it that way? Like, it is an optional rule that in the Dungeon Master's Guide, you can play D&D without a skill set. How many people actually did that? How many people did what Professor Dungeon Master was talking about and used a die roll for proficiency instead of using a static bonus? I bet you it's not very many, maybe 10%. 10% would be really high. I think it's actually even less than that. So when you have these optional rules, a lot of times they're either just considered default and they're thrown in there, or they're never even considered at all. So I don't know how big a deal it is, but it does feel like one of the things that I would have been excited about with 2024 is that idea of modularity. So there are some things that we can do about this. I have talked about the 4 major versions of 5e that are available that are all sort of intercompatible. We're going to see how intracompatible they are once we see the 2014 or the 2024 D&D books coming out over the next year. But we have the 2014 D&D, 2024 D&D, Level Up Advanced 5e, and Tales of the Valiant by Kobold Press. So we have 4 different versions of these games. So we can kind of build our own modular 5e. And the example is, like, how do we do that? Well, we start off by saying, what is going to be our core 5e? What is the core rule book that we expect players to be conforming to as the baseline, and that we are conforming to as the baseline? And we might say it's 2014 D&D. There are like 20 million copies of that book out there. Like, everybody that's been playing in D&D has those books already. They don't have to buy any new books. So we could just say, we're going to stick to the 2014 book. But then the modularity comes in on how do we want to modify that version of the book to best fit the table. And I think we should all become more comfortable adding some things in there to make it more modular. An example that I use is the luck system from Tales of the Valiant. I really love the luck system. I think it's way better than Inspiration. And even when I immediately switched over to Level Up Advanced 5e for one of my core games, I immediately threw the luck system on there because it's so much nicer to not have to manage Inspiration on the GM side. And my players really seem to love it. So that was like a total win-win for everything, right? I'm happier because I don't have to manage it. My players are happier because they have, when they fail rolls, they get a currency that they can use to increase rolls later on. That really worked nicely. So I really like the luck system. That's a good example. But some other examples are like spells. Like, what if you decide that the 5e book that you want to make core is Tales of the Valiant? I've been reading more about Tales of the Valiant. I really like it. But one of the things I think is a problem with that book is that I don't think they spent near enough time going back and looking at problematic spells and fixing those spells. Level Up Advanced 5e has fixed those spells. So we could say, hey, for this list of spells, here's a list of like five spells where we're going to use the Level Up Advanced version of that spell instead of using the spell that's in Tales of the Valiant. And that's like a slight modification. It means that we can kind of build the balance that we want, and we have a system that we like better. Now, you could also, I think if you're going to add a bunch of different things from one system, if you look at it and say, like, I want to add feats at first level, I want to add powered feats, and I want to have weapon masteries, well, then you might as well play 2024 D&D because all of those things are in there. But you could instead say, no, we're going to play 2014 D&D, but I am going to say you can pick a feat at first level. So really what we're talking about, and I think groups have already been doing this, lots of groups. So when we talk about all the groups that have been having potions as a bonus action, if you like, I really like the surprise rules from the 2024 D&D. I think those surprise rules are way better than the surprise rules that existed in 2014 D&D. And probably, I don't know what they are in Tales of the Valiant or Level Up Advanced 5e, but I don't think they're really that different from 2014. So I can steal that. I can even steal stuff from the playtest. Like, I like the exhaustion system that they tried testing out in one of the playtests where you just got -1 to all D20 D20 rolls. I thought that was so much more elegant than the existing exhaustion system. So what if I just include that? And I just never give exhaustion to characters. And instead I say, no, you're -1 on your DC or on your D20 rolls until you take it away. So really what I'm talking about is something that DMs have been doing for 50 years, which is you take the core books and then you add some house rules on it that you like. And I think everybody's been doing that for a long time. I think lots of different groups. The only groups that really have a hard time with this are any kind of organized play group or any kind of group where you're bringing new players on regularly and their expectation is that you're going to be playing with a core set of rules. That's a different circumstance. But for most home groups where you are able to control the rules of the game that you're running and you know the people that are going to be coming to your table, I think DMs have been modifying things all over the place already. So what do we do now? And what do we do to make a modular version of 5e is we pick our core system. What is the core fundamental rules that we are going to play with and that the players are going to play with? And then what modifications are we going to apply to those core rules from whatever system? They could either be house rules that we like that aren't in any books, but they specifically could be some of the rule sets that we like from the books that we're reading and some of the other books that are being published for 5e. So I think that that's a way for us to recapture the modularity that existed back when they were talking about what D&D Next was going to be like. And it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. I don't know that it's going to be 100% successful. I talked about this with some very smart friends of mine earlier this week who said like, hey, they tried that with the third edition of D&D. When 3E went to 3.5, the people that were playing 3E were very much like, why are we even doing this? Why switch? And they all said, we're just going to house rule 3E. That's all we're going to do is fix 3E because that's what we've got. And then he said, my friend who was bringing this up said, within 2 years, nobody was doing that. Within 2 years, everybody was using 3.5. Nobody was really using 3E. And now it's really rare to find anybody running 3E. But also 3E only lasted a couple of years. 2014 D&D has lasted 10 years. So it's a different circumstance than it was back then. And I think we're already getting used to house ruling stuff. So we're going to see how that goes. It's going to be a very interesting time. What is the best starter set for D&D? And is it the Shadowdark Quickstart Set? This is something I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks. I've been playing a lot of Shadowdark. I think I'm having like my 36th session of a big Shadowdark campaign, which is as big as like some of the D&D campaigns I've had. So it's a very, very big. But I've been thinking a lot about the Shadowdark Quickstart Set. And in particular, if somebody came to me and said, hey, I'd like to learn D&D, will you teach me? Am I better off starting with the Shadowdark set than I would be starting off with some of the D&D stuff? So that is the question that I am positing. And I think the real answer, just to get to the bottom line up front, it really depends on what you and your players are really looking for to determine whether or not Shadowdark is going to meet that need, or whether you're better off starting with like the D&D starter set for Dragon of Stormwreck Isle, a starter set that I really like. And the big question is, are you going to be building your characters or not? If you're building characters, I think character building in Shadowdark is significantly easier and faster than trying to teach somebody by building a character in D&D 5th edition. So that is a big one. So why would we even consider Shadowdark as a good way to introduce people to D&D? And the big reason is the super simple character design and character creation. There is no giant skill list. There's no proficiency bonus. Trying to explain to a player what a proficiency bonus is really, really weird. And most of the time you just don't do it. Instead, D&D Beyond either adds it in automatically, or some other virtual tabletop character builder automatically adds proficiency bonus. But people are looking at it like, why is my strength a 2, but my athletics score is a 4? And they're like, well, that's your proficiency bonus. Well, what's a proficiency bonus? Well, it's based on your level, but it's not linear to level. So you starts at 2 and it ends at 6. And you have to look at your level to see when your proficiency goes up. It's also an abstract concept because it's sort of like your generic skill bump, right? It's like it's the modifier that you add to skills that you're trying. It's really a pain to try to explain what a proficiency bonus is. Well, guess what? Shadowdark doesn't have a proficiency bonus. It's far easier. Shadowdark focuses heavily on the die roll and less on modifiers. You don't add modifiers for damage, for example. You just roll the die and that's the amount of damage you do. Significantly easier. Roll a d8, that's how much damage you do. Super, super easy to teach people how that works. Simplified movement. There's no movements in squares. There's no feet-based movement. Instead, you have near, and you have close, near, far, and I know my favorite one, double near. Double near is a little bit of something that you got to explain. But generally speaking, movement is streamlined, which means you're focusing more on the characters and the scene in the game and the action that's going on in the game. I am a huge fan of abstract distances and abstract movement in my RPGs. The fact that Shadowdark embraces that has made that really, really good for me. I like that so much more. Shadowdark really has a focus on the in-world choices that characters are making. This is sort of the whole difference between sort of modern RPGs and old school RPGs, is that modern RPGs often figure out situations by rolling a die. If you want to figure out if there's a secret door, you roll a perception check. If your check is higher than a certain amount, you find the door. It doesn't explain how your character found the door. The player doesn't say what they did in order to find the door. You can add that stuff in pretty easily. You can say like, well, how are you looking for the door? And if the way they're looking has no way that they would find the secret door, then they don't find it. If on the other hand, they say, well, I thoroughly searched the room, you're like, roll a perception check. Shadowdark doesn't have that. Shadowdark, you say, when you say that you're going to search the room, what do you do to search the room? And then they say things like, I go and I examine the cracks in the walls. Are there any cracks that are deeper than other ones? Well, yes, some of them are. Oh, that's interesting. Can I stick a lever in there? Yes, you can. If I pry the lever, does something move? Yes, actually, when you do that, the whole wall shifts and you see that there's a secret passage. So there's a lot more about the decisions that the players are making on behalf of their characters and how that interacts with the world instead of making checks for everything. That's a big distinguishing feature between the two games. I'm not judging one way or the other. I do both. I have 5th edition games where we roll for checks, and I have Shadowdark games where they do their in-world examination. I think there's advantages to both. But that is something that can be easier to teach a new player to say, to keep them into the world and understand what's different about this game. You describe how you search for things. I don't tell you how you search for them. I don't tell you what you find. You know, when I tell you what the situation is, you can ask clarifying questions. I will clarify those answers for you, and then you can figure out more. That is something that can be a good way to get somebody drawn in. One great thing about it is the price. The Shadowdark Quick Play rules, you can buy the print and PDF version for $19. I like this so much that I bought myself an extra set. So I think I have 3 sets, 2 of them still wrapped up, of the Shadowdark Quick Play guides because I just love them. They really feel like the old school version of D&D. They feel like you could put a little white box around this. It'd be kind of cool if they had a white box, but then the price would go up. And you get a really solid player guide that tells you how to play and a really solid game master guide that has enough material in it to run a lot of adventures. This isn't just like running one quick adventure and then you're done. This has enough monsters in it, enough magic items, and enough material to probably play for a good bunch of sessions. The adventure that isn't here is actually a pretty lengthy adventure that can take you up to 3rd level. It also includes, when you buy the physical version, these quick play cards of NPC, or not NPCs, the quick play cards of the player characters that you can use to actually run the game. Beautiful art on one side, really good, easily described character sheet on the other side that you can use for the players. So really excellent stuff. But here's where it's really cool. The PDF is free. It's absolutely free to pick up the PDF of this, which includes the pre-gen characters, which includes the books. It has everything in it and is completely free. One major advantage to this, beyond the fact that you can go download it, and you should go get it right now, and you should go check it out. If you've never checked out Shadowdark, there's no reason not to go download it and read it. But even better is you can send the PDF of it, or you can send the link here to your players so that they can get it for free. And that way they can read up on it and they can have their own copies of it on whatever device they've got or anything like that and have that available to them for free. There's a real advantage in putting like player's guides out for free. And it means that you're not expecting your player to have to go spend a bunch of money on something that they're not sure about yet. If the player guide is free, they can just go get it. And that means there's no reason your players can't all have a copy of this when you're playing at your game. That is a really big advantage for that. One other really interesting thing is even if you decide that this is really a jump board into a more complicated 5th edition game, even if you're planning to go to 5th edition, all of the stuff that your players learn when they're playing Shadowdark can be brought to 5th edition because Shadowdark under the hood is mostly 5th edition mechanics. The whole ability score bumps are the same, how you roll your dice are the same, the types of dice that you use are the same, D20 rolls are the same. There's some new stuff that they'll have to learn, like skills, like proficiency bonuses, like ability checks. There's a lot of different, like adding modifiers onto damage rolls. There are things that they would learn if they move from Shadowdark to 5th edition, but almost all of it is additive. Almost all of it is new stuff that they would add on. Yes, they'll have to relearn how the magic system works. There's a few things that they'll have to learn, but a lot of the material that's inside the Shadowdark books can be, and I'm going to use the word upgraded, but I know that that's kind of insulting to say that, well, Shadowdark is below 5th edition. It's really just 2 different kinds of games. But you can move from one game to the other, and all of the knowledge that your new players have picked up from Shadowdark can be brought with them when they go to 5th edition. Now, there's one big reason why I think that Shadowdark might not be the absolute best starter set for the game, and that's its lethality. Now, one difference is you know the lethality up front. And if you're a GM who is going to be teaching people how to play using Shadowdark rules, you can do probably 3 things to make it better, even though it's as lethal as it is. One is explain to the players how lethal it is, and that almost certainly one or more of them are going to get killed in their scenario, that it's very easy to be killed in this game. And that's an expected feature of this game, and that's different from modern iterations of D&D. 2 is have a bunch of extra characters on hand. Make it easy for people to get back into the game. So when their character dies, you say, oh, that was really funny. You can go over the top, but here's the other new character. So they don't get tied to any one character. Instead, they're really learning the game, and they can still participate in the game. And then 3 is in the story of the world, make sure there's a good reason for new characters to be able to jump in. When I was running a level 0 gauntlet in Shadowdark, I had 40 different character sheets ready to go. And I had a really easy way to drop in new characters and have them show up during the game. I did the same thing when I ran my Ravenloft game. It was like, you're in the cart and you're all heading to Ravenloft, but there's like 30 of you in there, but only the first 5 are going to be the ones going in. So it's like, oh, these are other people that have been going there in the past. We're able to drop them in. That way, the most important thing when characters die is making sure that players can still stay engaged with the game. So you want to make sure to include that if you're going to have the lethality of the game. Now, another thing that you can do if you want to kind of work with the lethality of Shadowdark, and I went over to the Shadowdark Discord and I asked, like, hey, how bad is this from a Shadowdark perspective? And I kind of laid myself out on the Shadowdark altar, prepared for them to all pierce into my skin with their wavy obsidian daggers as a heretic of Shadowdark. And I got a little of that, which was, how about if you just maximize the hit points at first level? And some people were all like, oh, that's absolute heresy. It's more important that they understand how dangerous it is and behave and act, recognizing the fact that they can get killed in a single hit. But then people also brought up, well, actually, and I think Kelsey confirmed this, a lot of the character pre-gens have hit points that are higher. Not all of them, but like this fine fellow, Jorbin Ironhelm, a dwarf fighter, has 10 hit points. 10 is a ton of hit points at first level. This fella, this young lady, Uriel, is an elf fighter. She has 8 hit points. So not all of them do. Some have 3. Here's a 3 hit pointer. Here's a 3 hit pointer. So we got like 4 of them have 3 hit points. But then we've got 7 hit points. We've got 5 hit points. They actually have more hit points than you might expect for a Shadowdark character. We had a Shadowdark character who had 3 hit points at 3rd level because they rolled a 1 3 times for their hit points. So you can definitely have some low ones. But if you want, and I give you permission, other people can yell at me, boost up their hit points a little bit. If you want, just give them 5 extra hit points. If you just want them to understand the game, they're just learning for the first time, you'd rather they don't get killed right away, just give them a little bit of extra hit points. Say they have 5 extra. Maybe some of them do. So you could say like, or start them, probably better is start them off at max hit points. So whatever the max hit points are, and you can even change them from the way they are in the pre-gens and say like, you have 6 hit points, you have 8 hit points, you have 10 hit points. That way they have just a little bit more so that maybe it takes 2 or 3 hits to knock them out instead of 1. I think that might be a better time for new GMs. So one of the things that's kind of funny though, and I was thinking about it just this morning before I was going to talk about this whole thing, was, am I being a hypocrite? Because I'm the one who complained about Dragon of Icespire Peak having ochre jellies at first level and having manticores at first level who could definitely wipe out characters in 1 hit. And I complained about that, saying like, why are we putting out starter sets? And Lost Mine of Fandelver also had like a really brutal first fight. And I was like, are we doing this just to weed out players from the hobby, to say like, oh, you had a bad time, so now you don't play? So I complained about that fact because I don't feel like you should wipe out characters just willy-nilly in the beginning of your starter set. I don't know that that's the best experience for that. And I actually recommended doing things like giving them the spell Aid right off the bat so that everybody had 5 extra hit points and they could last a little bit longer. And that way it wasn't so bad. Dragon of Stormwreck Isle, the latest D&D starter set, actually says like if they all wipe out, they are all brought back by the main NPC and they can start again. So it has sort of a lower floor. You can't really lose. You can't get wiped out. Now, a lot of people are like, oh, that's just training wheels D&D. Well, that's okay, for crying out loud. Let people play and enjoy their characters. Now, I think that it's not quite so hypocritical in the fact that when you are teaching using Shadowdark, you can explain to them, A, you're probably going to die a lot, and B, we have other pre-gens and other ways for you to come in. So if your character dies, you can get another character and get back into the game pretty quickly. So I think that there are still ways to do that. Whether or not Shadowdark is the best way to teach people D&D is kind of a question for you and for the people you're teaching. A lot of it is, what do they bring to the table already? Are they big fans of anime? Have they already played Baldur's Gate 3 and they already understand a lot about how 5th edition works? What kind of fiction do they understand? What kind of video games that they've played? If they're really big into Dark Souls, maybe the Shadowdark is not so bad because they're used to getting killed all the time. What are the things that they're bringing to the table? And then that will help you decide which version of D&D you want to be teaching them. But I'll tell you, when it comes to the simplicity of the mechanics, the focus on what the fun of the game is, the fact that you can download free rules for it, the Shadowdark Quick Play rules really feel like an outstanding way to teach new players how to play D&D. I mentioned getting access to the Lazy DM community over on our Discord server. I've mentioned that it helps me put on shows like this, but they also get lots of other features as well. And one of the really great things about the support that I get from Patreon is it gives me freedom to take more of the stuff that I'm creating and make it available. One of the things that I'm able to do, for example, is I created a thing called the complete slyflourish.com archive. So I have I don't know how many, ton of different articles up on Sly Flourish that I've had for the past 15 years. And one of the things that's important to me is that people could actually download the entire site's worth of articles, including all of the markdown files and all of the HTML files, and have it in one archive. So I created the complete slyflourish.com archive and made it available to patrons of Sly Flourish. The way this works is that every Tuesday, it creates the archive in a zip file. You can download it whenever you want. When you download it, it gives you a nice 7 megabyte zip file. It's actually 8.7 megabytes, I lied. It gives you a nice zip file. You can open that file up, and in it are all of the files, and there's a readme at the very top of the file, _readme, that tells you everything that's in here and tells you that there's an index.html and an archive.html file. It is all run locally. So once you download it, you can open it up on your computer and you can view the whole thing locally. And this is an example of what it shows you when you have it locally. You can see all of the images are not there. And other than that, it's pretty much a direct mirror of the entire Sly Flourish website in a single file. You click on articles and you get the full article text on there. You also get access to all of the markdown versions of each file in case you want to do something with those, right? So you have that available. The last thing I did is I made all of this work available, and this again is because of the support that I get from Patreon. All of these articles are available under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial License. So you are free to have a copy of these files, to move those files around, to send those files to your friends, and to build things on top of these files as long as you're doing so without any commercial use. That includes you can't put it up on your own website and put ads on it, but you can use the material for lots of other things that you want to use for. So if you want to dig through all the markdown files, you can. If you just want to have a copy of the whole archive, do we trust that Sly Flourish will be around forever? I don't. I'm running it, and I don't assume it's going to be around forever. So this is a way for you to have access to all of the articles that are there. So there's about 750 articles that are available in HTML and Markdown, available to patrons of Sly Flourish in the complete Sly Flourish archive. You can find this available on your Patreon rewards page, but also there is one of the recent Patreon posts talks about the archive. But the easiest way to find this, plus all of the other rewards that you get for being a patron of Sly Flourish, is by going to the Patreon page as a patron and looking at the first pinned post, which has all of your rewards in there, and it is one of the many, many different rewards that you get for being a patron of Sly Flourish. And of course, to the patrons, thank you so much for your support. Let's cover a couple of Patreon questions. So another feature of being a patron of Sly Flourish is access to the Patreon Q&A. Every month, I put up a new thread. I answer all of the questions that RPG-related questions that go on that thread. Some of those I bring here to the show so that we can talk more in depth about the topics, the excellent topics that they bring up. Matthew D says, since COVID, our group has moved to a VTT. At first, we loved the battle map gaming, but it has made DMing a lot of hard work because you need the perfect map that fits the scenario. Has anyone come up with a good system that allows for some battle map gaming and some theater of the mind? I have some tips. So I actually think that this is one of the newer ways that running games online has gotten harder for people. The more features a VTT has that you use, the harder it is to get everything set up. And there's really probably two big areas that I'm going to pick on today. And if you hear both of these and you say, no, those are still really important to me, that's totally fine. But if you are having trouble with time, if it is taking you a lot of extra time to get set up, these are two things that you might consider. One is you don't have to have everything snapped to the grid. You don't have to find the absolute perfect map size and make sure that that map size is pixel perfect to the grid that you have in your VTT. Instead, there are two things you can do. And I think almost every VTT supports this. One is remove the physical grid so you cannot see the grid. And 2 is remove the snap to grid so that tokens won't snap to a grid that won't necessarily align. Then you can kind of size your map to whatever size you want that kind of fits what you need. You can actually place a token on the map and then have the entire map scaled around the size of that token. Do you want hallways to be 5 feet or 10 feet or 20 feet? You can decide how big you want the map to be based on the size of that token. If you have a game where you really want to be keeping track of individual movements and 5-foot squares and things like that, you can use distance tools. Almost every VTT that I know of includes a tool that lets you see how far the distance is between one thing and another. This means that you don't actually have to worry about how you move in zigzags or how you handle fireballs on corner edge cases. There's lots of reasons to avoid using the grid and instead use distances for it. But one of the big ones is it's far easier to set up maps for your game when you don't have to have things snap to the grid. So remove the visual grid and remove snapping to the grid, and it's a lot easier to align maps. Another thing you can do is a lot of these systems now include some kind of dynamic lighting, some kind of way of saying these are walls that are opaque and that light can't shine through. These are walls that aren't. It takes a lot of time to set up those kinds of dynamic lighting situations for maps that don't already have them built in. Instead, just use a basic fog of war. You don't have to get too fancy with it. Your players don't really care. Lean on showing too much just so that players can feel like they're engaged. I had a player who brought up the fact that one time when she was playing like a warlock and she spent most of her time around a corner, she never actually saw what the room looked like, this big fancy room that they were having a battle in, because she was kind of peeking her head around and firing. It meant that with the dynamic lighting situation, she never actually got to see it. And it was like, totally wasted. I have another player who's blind, and any kind of work on a VTT, all of the extra effort that's done in a VTT is completely unimportant to her. It does not help her at all. And so in that case, we play with theater of the mind. But for the players who are sighted, we have ways to kind of say, well, this is a way that you can actually see how things operate. And the last one is to run things kind of like a Final Fantasy situation, like the old Final Fantasy games, where you worry more about abstract positioning and maybe use a backdrop. I have the Dwarven Forge virtual tabletop backdrops that I have to, again, another thing for patrons. Sorry, I'm promoting the Patreon a lot today. But it's a nice, fun way to have a fun backdrop that you can drop tokens on and show the relative distance between combatants rather than worrying about specific distances. And you'll find that working with those relative distances makes it easier and faster to set up maps, still kind of show what the positioning is, because it's important to show what that positioning is, but not spend a lot of time dealing with VTT. A lot of what I just said is heresy to many. I understand that. If you don't like it, you certainly don't have to listen to my advice. But I really think that, in many cases, all of those things can take a significant amount of time and be harder to set up and make it harder for us to get a game ready for our group. Gustavo C. says, the new 2024 books, from all I hear so far, are mostly about re-imaging with mixed success, some player options. But as I see that information from the GM side, I feel less inclined to run a 2024 group than a 2014 group. This question is for Sly Flourish and also for the other GMs here. Do you feel the same? I might adopt the option to take a potion also as a bonus action, and I might poach other things as house rules, but that's it. What I have are very serious doubts about the new spells and the new masteries. From my point of view, this introduces an imbalance that makes designing an encounter for a fight harder, as the same amount of enemies will now be trampled, leading to an escalation that might as well end up in a TPK. So yeah, I talked about this both on the last show and I talked about it today on this show. And I think the best way around this is for us to decide which core version of the rules work best for us and then house ruling those in order to get them to work. I think it's easier for us to house rule new stuff in than it is to house rule old stuff or stuff that exists out. So I think we're probably better off with starting with the most slim version, which is probably the 2014 D&D rules, and then deciding which components we're going to add on. What's interesting is you bring up you have doubts about new spells and new masteries. I'm actually pretty bullish on the spells because I'm hoping that they're going to be able to fix a lot of the problems that we've had with problematic spells. But on the other hand, we're going to have some spells where I think they're going to make it even worse. I'm thinking about Blade Ward. They apparently made Blade Ward a concentration spell for a minute. And because it's a cantrip, that means your player has Blade Ward up 100% of the time. Because why not have Blade Ward up if it takes no spell slot to cast it? Stuff like that, where you're like, why did they do that? But on the other hand, improvements to things like Counterspell, the summon spells, there's a lot of spells that could use some work. But all of the game systems have been modifying it in some different degrees. So we can decide, well, which spell variants do we like? And maybe we say, I actually like the level up advanced 5e version of Counterspell better than any of the other counter spells. So I'm going to want to use that one. If we make it too complicated, it can kind of get our players kind of miffed off because they're like, I don't understand what we're even doing anymore. So we want to be a little bit careful with that and really only put in the improvements that we think are going to have a significant impact in the game. Otherwise, we might not worry about it too much. But Gustavo, I think we are all kind of feeling like that. One thing I think is interesting is I feel like all of these preview videos that have come up have actually made me more skeptical about 2024 D&D than I was when I didn't know anything. So we'll see when the books come out exactly what goes on. And frankly, it's going to take us probably a year before we'll really understand what goes on. Friends, I want to thank everybody for hanging out with me today while we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. If you enjoyed this show, again, you can support me directly on Patreon. You can also sign up for the Sly Flourish newsletter. The newsletter gives you access to all of the work that I do across all of the different areas of the internet, including tips, video previews, all kinds of things, but also a Lazy DM article sent right to your inbox every week. You also get a free adventure generator PDF, and you can pick up any of my existing books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, Lazy DM's Companion, Forge of Foes, and all the fantastic adventure books on the Sly Flourish bookstore. But what you could really do to help me out is go over to the Kickstarter page. You can find it a link in the show notes, the preview page, and click Notify to be launched so that you will learn about the City of Arches Kickstarter, which is coming out August 6th. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.